You are looking at a crock of vegetables, preserved with nothing but salt. One ingredient, an entire harvest, no canning, no freezer, no electricity. That crock will keep every vegetable inside safe for over a year. This is dry salting, the method that fed empires. The ratio is precise. The consequences of getting it wrong are far worse than waste. But master it, and you hold the simplest food insurance ever devised. Before canning, before refrigeration, salt was the only line between a good harvest and a starved winter. And here is the thing. That knowledge didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because convenience made us forget it. But when the power fails or the shelves go empty, this crock will still be there. It's time to learn exactly how it works. So let's go back, way back, to a time when salt wasn't just a seasoning. It was a survival tool so valuable that Roman soldiers were paid in it. The word salary comes from sal, the Latin word for salt. For thousands of years, civilizations across the world preserved entire harvests with nothing but layered vegetables and salt. No electricity, no glass jars, no boiling water bath. The Chinese were doing it in 6000 BC. The Koreans perfected it with kimchi. Portuguese sailors loaded barrels of salted cabbage onto ships that wouldn't see land for a year. And the process worked on a single brutal principle: osmosis. Salt pulls water out of vegetable cells and out of the microbes that cause rot. Without water, bacteria, molds, and yeasts cannot live. The food stays safe. Not because it's sealed in a sterile vacuum, but because the environment inside that crock becomes chemically uninhabitable to anything that wants to spoil it. That chemical reality hasn't changed in 8,000 years. What changed is who remembers it. In 1809, a French confectioner named Nicolas Appert won a prize from Napoleon for a new method. He heated food in sealed glass jars. Appert didn't know why it worked. Pasteur wouldn't prove germ theory for another half-century. But it worked. Canning was born, and what followed was a slow, quiet erasure. By the 1950s, every American kitchen had a freezer. The age of convenience had arrived. The old salt crocks were moved to basements, used as flower pots, or thrown away. Why spend 2 days layering salt when you could buy a bag of frozen peas? The food industry never conspired to bury salt preservation. They didn't have to. They just sold you something easier. And we traded security for that ease so completely that most people today cannot name a single salt-to-vegetable ratio that keeps food safe without refrigeration. But here is where this gets urgent. When the power fails, or the supply chain snaps, every freezer is a time bomb. You have 48 hours before everything thaws and rots. A salt crock gives you a year. The difference comes down to 3 precise ratios and a safety line you cannot cross. Miss that line by 0.5%, and you are not preserving food. You are cultivating a pathogen that can kill you. The first method is the simplest, the oldest, and the one almost nobody remembers how to do right. Dry salting. I'll show you the number next. The number is 1 tablespoon for every 1.5 pounds of vegetables. Dry salting. The oldest preservation method. Not a brine, not a pickle. Just solid salt crystals, layered between your vegetables until the crock is full. You pack it tight. The salt draws moisture out of the plant cells through osmosis. That released water dissolves the salt and creates its own brine. The food sits protected in a liquid it made itself. And here is what makes this method almost idiot-proof. When you understand it, once that brine forms, the salt concentration around the vegetables is roughly 8 to 10%. That is more than double what any spoilage organism can survive. The vegetables shrink, soften slightly, and remain shelf-stable for over a year. No refrigeration, no canning seal, just a lid and a cool, dark corner. People preserved cabbage, green beans, turnips, and radishes this way for millennia. But dry salting has a hard limit that almost nobody talks about. It only works for low moisture, firm vegetables. Leafy greens turn to slime, soft fruits collapse, and some vegetables, like squash, release too much water and dilute the salt below the safety threshold. That is where the second method enters, and the ratio that separates a family's winter food supply from a crock that can kill them. Brining. This is the method most people think of when they hear salt preservation. But the number is not 1 tablespoon per anything. The ratio is a percentage, and it is calculated not by volume but by weight. You weigh your vegetables, you weigh your water, add them together, then multiply by the salt percentage you need. For cabbage, for sauerkraut, that number is 2%. For cucumbers and summer squash, the minimum safe percentage is 3. For peppers and green beans, you can push it to 5% for a longer shelf life. The difference between 2% and 3 sounds small. It is not. 2% salt selects for a specific type of bacteria, Leuconostoc and Lactobacillus. These are beneficial. They feed on the vegetable sugars and produce lactic acid. That acid drops the pH below 4.6. Below that line, the spores that cause botulism cannot germinate. The food is safe because the environment turned sour, not just salty. But miss that line. Add 2% when the vegetable needs 3, and the acid never drops fast enough. The liquid stays neutral. The spores wake up, and the pathogen that produces the most lethal toxin known to science can multiply silently. No smell, no visible change, no warning taste. That is the cost of 0.5%. And this is the pivot that changes everything about how you look at a salt crock. Salt does not preserve food alone. Salt builds a battlefield. It dehydrates the enemies you can see and invites the allies you cannot. This is the single most misunderstood fact about traditional preservation, and it was understood thousands of years before anyone invented a microscope. Ancient civilizations did not know about lactic acid bacteria. They did not know about Clostridium botulinum. They knew through brutal trial and error that certain salt levels worked and certain ones killed. They passed the ratios down like a sacred text, and they built a food system that could survive sieges, famines, and winter. Now, you need to understand what those ratios look like in your own kitchen before you make the mistake that turns preservation into poison. The first mistake people make is using the wrong salt. Table salt, the white iodized crystals in the blue cylinder. Iodine is an antiseptic. It kills the very bacteria you need to ferment vegetables safely. Anti-caking agents cloud your brine and can give it off flavors. You need pure salt. Kosher salt without additives or sea salt, but even that has a trap. Kosher salt crystals vary in density. A tablespoon of Morton kosher salt weighs different than a tablespoon of diamond crystal. If you measure by volume instead of weight, your 2% brine might actually be 1.5 or 3. That 0.5% error we just talked about. That is how it happens in a real kitchen. With a scale, you eliminate it. Weigh everything in grams. That is the only way. But salt type is just the beginning. Even with the right salt and the right weight, there is a hidden variable that the old manuals never mention because it was common knowledge they assumed everyone had. The water. If you use chlorinated tap water, the chlorine can inhibit the beneficial bacteria, just like iodine. You need to let it sit out overnight to off-gas, or use filtered water, or well water. In the old days, water came from a well. It was alive. Today's tap water is a chemical bath. The modern person who tries to ferment cucumbers with tap water and iodized salt ends up with a jar of mush and a stomach-churning odor in 2 weeks. Then they blame the method, not the chemicals that poisoned it. But dry salting and brining are not the only ways salt keeps food. There is a third method so simple it survived in only a handful of cultures, and it works on vegetables you would never think to preserve: salt curing. Not just for meat. In Morocco, they pack lemons in salt and their own juice, and a year later, you have an ingredient that transforms a dish. In Italy, capers are preserved in salt. This is the method where you use so much salt that the food essentially mummifies. It draws out nearly all the water, leaving a product that can sit on a shelf for years without refrigeration. But here is the catch. You have to desalt it before you eat it. Soak it in water for hours. Change the water. Taste. Otherwise you will take a bite of a carrot that tastes like the Dead Sea. And that process, that extra step, is what made people abandon salt curing when canning arrived. Convenience won, but the shelf life of salt-cured vegetables is not 1 year. It is 5, 10 years. I have seen a jar of salt-preserved lemons made in 2010 that were still perfect. That kind of storage is not just for garden surplus. It is for the collapse of the supply chain, and that is what nobody is telling you. But wait, it gets bigger. The salt ratio is not just about your crock of green beans. It is about a global food system that has abandoned salt preservation so thoroughly that the average household now wastes 30% of the food it buys, according to the USDA, over $1,000 a year thrown into a landfill. Meanwhile, the food industry is perfectly happy to sell you freezers and vacuum sealers and canning lids that degrade. They profit from the cycle of spoilage and replacement. Salt does not bring them a repeat customer. A salt crock is a one-time purchase of a bag of salt and a ceramic pot. It never needs a replacement part. It never needs electricity. It never demands an upgrade. That is why you do not see ads for salt preservation. Not because it does not work, but because it works too well for too little money, for too long. And the knowledge of how to do it safely was deliberately left out of the curriculum of modern home economics. Ask a random person under 40 how to salt preserve green beans. They will have no idea, but they can tell you how to use a vacuum sealer. That is not an accident. Now you understand the battlefield, the enemies and allies, the ratios and the traps. But before you fill your first crock, you need to see what happens when you get it right. How long the food actually lasts. How to store it, and the most important step that every recipe forgets. How to bring it back to life on your plate without tasting like a salt lick. That is next. When you crack the lid on a salt crock after 6 months, the first thing that hits you is not rot. It is a sharp, clean, sour scent, like a fresh pickle, but earthier, deeper. The vegetables have shrunk slightly. The colors have muted, but they are intact, not slimy, not moldy. The brine that started as salt and vegetable water is now a living liquid, cloudy with beneficial bacteria, tangy with lactic acid. You have just opened a time capsule that never needed electricity, and the food is safer than the day you harvested it. Shelf life is not a guess. It is a documented fact. Dry salted vegetables, kept in a cool, dark place, will hold for 12 to 18 months. I have seen crocks at 18 months, where the green beans were still firm. Brine fermented vegetables, when the pH drops below 4.6, can last 2 years or more. The USDA does not give an official endorsement, but families across Eastern Europe and Asia have eaten year-old kraut their entire lives. Salt-cured lemons, packed in nothing but salt and their own juice, are often still perfect at 5 years. Some Moroccan families crack jars from a decade ago. The only limits are mold from air exposure or a faulty seal. So you keep your vegetables submerged, you keep your lid on, and you check once a month. That is the whole maintenance schedule. But the real payoff is not the storage. It is the moment you pull a handful from the crock and prepare to eat them. And this is the step that separates a meal from a salt lick. You must desalt. For dry salted vegetables, rinse them under cold water to wash away the surface salt. Then soak them in fresh water for at least 2 hours. Change the water once. Soak another hour. Taste. If it is still too salty, soak again. For brine ferments, you do not always need to desalt, but the brine itself is a resource. Use it to start your next ferment, or add a spoonful to a soup for an instant umami depth that no bouillon cube can match. The flavor of properly desalted, preserved vegetables is not just salty. It is savory, complex, with a quiet sourness that wakes up a stew or a skillet of roasted potatoes. It is the taste of food that has been chemically transformed by time and alive microbes. You cannot buy that in a can. Now, before I show you the one crock, one vegetable, one Sunday afternoon starting point that anyone can do, I need to hand you the final number. The number that makes this whole method the single best food insurance you can own. A 5-pound bag of pure kosher salt costs under $4. That bag can preserve 50 pounds of vegetables, 50 pounds of fresh green beans at the farmer's market in peak season might cost you $20. So for less than $25 and 3 hours of work, you have a year's supply of a vegetable that costs $2 a can at the grocery store. And those cans, how long do they last in a long-term blackout? At room temperature, commercially canned food is safe for years, but once the seal is compromised, it is trash. A salt crock does not need a seal. It does not need a power grid. It only needs you to remember what your great-grandparents knew without a single book or class. That is the real payoff. Food security that does not depend on a supply chain, a freezer, or a can opener. It just depends on salt, a pot, and the wisdom to use them. And that wisdom was almost lost, not because it was difficult, but because it was too simple for an industry that profits from complexity. When you hold a crock of vegetables that will still feed your family a year from now, you are holding something bigger than food. You are holding a quiet rebellion against planned obsolescence, against the idea that only the grid can keep you alive. The question is, what other old ways are waiting in the quiet memory of people who never needed a freezer, never needed a canning lid, and never asked permission from anyone to eat? Those are the skills that look useless until one Tuesday the power doesn't come back. If this made sense to you, hit subscribe and ring the bell. I don't make videos for the algorithm. I make them for people who know something is missing. And if you are ready to put this into practice, I have a special offer for you in the first pinned comment. It is a complete guide with the exact salt ratios by weight for every vegetable you can grow or buy, plus the safety checks I could not cover in one video. The link is right there. Thank you for staying to the end. Now, go fill a crock.